welcome to Springboot series. Today we are going to look into the annotations which are used in Springboot. So uh, this happens to be one of the important questions as well when it comes to an interview, when you're attending a Java based interview. So interviewer expects uh, annotations. They would like to know in your projects what kind of annotations you have used in. So today we'll dig dive into seeing what kind of different annotations we have in Spring Boot. So let's get started. So I've categorized the Spring Boot annotations into core annotations, data access annotations, configuration annotations, testing annotation, and many more. There are quite more annotations, but we'll limit this video to these four core annotations, which we'll be covering up in the next slides. So let's look into the first slide. So we're talking about the core annotations. So any whether you have started your Spring Boot application or you're developing for the first time or you're an experienced developer, uh, this is one of the annotations which is the must, and without this I think the uh, Spring Boot application will not run. But yeah, uh, this is the very starting point. This is written in the main class of a Spring Boot application. So, so this is one of the primary annotations used in the Spring application. So this basically, if you must have heard of, like, this is a combination of three annotations. So at the rate configuration, at the rate enable auto configuration, and at the rate component scan. So basically, if you are using these three annotations versus the at the rate Spring Boot application, this is all means the same. So it will perform the same thing. It will just load. It will perform the auto configuration. It will exclude the classes. It will include the classes. It will perform. It will component scan in the packages, right? So this Spring Boot application, it requires uh, is required by a Spring Boot application to be must, right? So other alternative for this is, as I said, you can use this three annotation in place of that. Second, at the rate rest controller. This is an annotation that indicates restful controller. So it allows you to handle your request uh, and it responds like JSON or XML. But your HTTP request, whatever you make a request from either Postman or any other client, right? So you'll be able to land on this particular REST controller. From here, actually, you have different mappings been defined so that it's actually mapped to the methods. So if you follow the REST architecture, you will be able to see, like, you'll be having different set of methods defined, right? So the next annotation what we are going to talk about is request mapping. This is an annotation which, as I said, it is going to map your request to a specific methods within the controller. So inside this REST controller, you will have this at the rate request mapping. So you can specify the URLs over here, and then you can map it to the specific methods, HTTP methods. Like, we have getters, we have post, we have put, we have delete, and there is an HTTP header as well. So each uh, methods play a different role, and, like, it is used for a different reason. So if you are aware of the REST architecture, like, it's a resource. We are defining some resource and then we are playing around it, right? So we are trying to add a resource, we are trying to update a resource, we are performing CRUD operation. So I've given a practical code example over here. We could have looked it into an IntelliJ, but I thought it will be better if I give you an example in the presentation itself. So instead of switching to the code and then showing it, but yeah, I covered everything, like where the practical code it made use of this particular Spring Boot application, right? So if you see, as I said, this is the main class. So if you see public static void main, and then you will see the Spring application run. But if you see at the top right, there is an at the rate Spring Boot application. So you can either use this or either three of them which we just showcased. At the rate rest controller. So and the at the rate request mapping. So this is, if you see both, this denotes that it's one of the stereotype, I would say, annotations which indicates that it's an controller. And request mapping is, as I said, like it will be, the request will be mapped to this particular URL, and then inside this you can define certain methods which is we discussed. So here if you see there is a get mapping. So here actually basically we are trying to fetch something based on the ID which we are passing. We'll look into some other annotations further, but yeah, these are the core annotations which are uh, you required when you're developing a Spring Boot application. So there are different other mappings. If you see for get, this is for retrieving the method. So it is shortened method. So this is the syntax where we, on top of that particular method, we will be writing this, request method, and then request mapping, and then we'll be defining the method, right? Uh, so you can either write this at the rate request mapping and then define that particular method, or you can either directly write this at the rate get mapping. So it's either either one of them you can write it and then achieve the same thing, right? So similarly it is applicable for put mapping. This is the annotation, this is a shorthand, right? So you can define similar to the put, delete. So put is something which is used for you want to update something, right? So as a resource, right? So you use that. For delete, you want to delete any of the resources you have already added previously. Path variable. So this is an annotation which is used to extract the value from the URL. So let's say in the URL you have passed some parameter value, right? So let's say we wanted a product which is with the number one, right? So in the product slash one, right? So this is one which will extract that value from that URL, and it will be bind to that particular parameter. So you can define that particular inside that particular method when you're trying to address that. We'll see the example as well. uh, there is an at the rate request para. This annotation is used to bind the query. So if you go to the URL and then you will have the query parameter, and then you will have the username and I mean the key and value, right? So you will have that request param inside that, and you can map it to the params right in the URL itself, right? At the rate request process. This is uh, when you're trying to request any request by hitting the URL, right? You will be having a request which can be added. So let's say you're using a Postman, you will have a request body, right, where you can either you define a JSON or whatever it is, right? So you map that particular JSON or whatever request to that particular value. So in that method you will be able to annotate that with the direct request body. We'll see the examples in the next slides. So for the get mapping, if you see here, there is a product, right? So you will be able to fetch all the products. Here you will see you are fetching all the products. Similarly, you can actually put an element for it, right? So you are trying to update any resource, right? You are trying to, so if you see here this path variable, we spoke about it, right? So this is this ID, whatever it is, what you are mapping, it will be mapped to the long, right? So and then we spoke about and we'll see in the next slide, but the request body as well, where you are trying to get that particular JSON element mapped to this particular product. And so this is for delete. So we are trying to give the if you see there is a path variable over here where it is being mapped to this particular ID, it will be automatically taken up, and then you can use it for deleting the specific resource. uh, if you see the product uh, this is for get mapping, right? So you can use this. Now we'll look into the other request params, right? So This was one of the request parameters using the URL, right? We will be able to get that. So this is the mandatory. So if you see the string with the category will take it as an will be mapped to the request parameter after the question mark, right, in the URL. And this is for post mapping. If you see that the request body we spoke about, so it's a object where from the JSON it will be directly mapped to this particular object, right? So it will be automatically assigning those and it will be mapped to it and it will be automatically assigned uh, the attributes. So uh, apart when you're learning for the concept, right, there apart from this I have also tried to mention the interview questions which are most frequently asked around the core annotations. So if you see the very first beginning questions which interview might ask you to for an annotation, right, he will just ask you what kind of annotations you have used in your projects. You will try to understand have you used this annotation in your projects. Then what are the components that at the red Spring Boot application combined? So if you see, this will be the combination of these three annotations which we spoke about. So interviewer will try to get that, specifically ask this question to understand like whether he deeply know this particular annotation, what it does, right? So this is one of the frequently asked questions. Now next is how does a Spring Boot application simplifies the setup of an Spring Boot application. So how this particular Spring Boot internally works, and then it helps to simplify your setup of an Spring Boot application. This question is most frequently asked. When we would like to use Spring Boot application over individual annotations. So as I said, it's a combination of three, right? So they would try to understand when to use this particular annotation and when to use this particular added configuration. So I think if you try to define this particular three annotation and you can actually define those more granular, you have more control to exclude or scan which packages inside it. Of course, like in at the rate Spring Boot application also will have that configuration, but explicitly defining those things will give you a more granular control and to define those configuration and then the components. So there is an annotation as we spoke about at the rate REST controller. So it's as we spoke about, it will be the request which is going to land on this particular controller. How does it differ from the controller? So the interview might prior to if you're using the REST the REST controller, right, there was a normal controller at the rate controller. So this is one of the parent to this particular at the rate REST controller. So now it's a combination. If you're using at the rate controller, right, you need to have that particular response body in order to get that particular return a specific return. You're trying to return that particular response, right? So it's a combination of that, at the rate controller. Then you are trying to map it at the rate response body, right? So it's a combination of the at the rate controller is a combination of both, right? So when would you use the at the rate request controller versus when you would use the at the rate controller? So we just spoke about that part. Now explain different attributes of the request mapping. So there are different when you define this particular at the rate request mapping, right? You have different attributes which are like path, method, reduces, consumes. So these are attributes which will make the you know understand what kind of input it requires, what kind of URL it is, what kind of output uh, it sends as a backend response. So there are more interview questions like how can you map an HTTP request to a specific method in a controller using the request method. So you define that particular uh, methods, right? You specify those particular methods inside that in that particular attribute, right? What is the shorthand annotation? So we looked into there is a shorthand annotations for all this, right? Get mapping, post mapping, put mapping, delete mapping. How do you extract value from the URL? So we looked about at the red path variable. So we already mentioned like in the URL with this product slash curly braces and then ID, it will actually automatically get mapped to that particular thing using the path method. So what is the advantage of using at the rate path over the dynamic URL? So instead of using the URL, you will be able to use this particular path variable so that you just specify that value and then it will be taken. How do you bind that particular query from the URL to a controller method using the at the rate request parent? So it is actually based on that, after the question mark, we will have some certain parameters. It will be directly mapped using the at the rate request params. What is the difference between at the rate request param and path variable? So they're both used in different context and like in a different scenario where you are from the URL you are trying to map that particular value, you are trying to get that, we use that, and then based on the query, right, the query kind of parameter, the question part, we can use at the rate request param. Next, we are going to look onto the configuration annotations. So these are kind of configuration annotation which are required, like you are defining a bean, you are trying to read some external properties values from an application.properties or a different property files. You're trying to map some values to an certain attributes in a class. We'll be using this configuration. So the very basic thing is at the rate configuration. This annotation indicates that the class is in configuration class. So it indicates that this particular class has got all the configuration related information. So we can actually define some annotations like at the rate bin configuration. We can bean at the rate bean as I said, and at the rate uh, bean as I said, right? So we can use in the application context, right? So to get that particular beans. So at the rate bean, this is an annotation as I said you can use in the configuration with help in combination of at the rate configuration. So whether you are trying to get any bean from the application context, right? It will be loaded, and then when you call that particular bean with any other specific methods, you will be able to get that instance, right? This is at the rate properties. So this is used to load properties from external properties, whether you are trying to load an external properties apart from the application.properties or application.yml. You can define that particular in the application.property with that property file path, like you have to define that in dot import, and then give the path of that particular file, and then make use of this particular at the rate value combination. This will inject that particular value, the field property values inside this particular field, right? So it will inject that the whatever the key and value where you have defined it, right, it will automatically inject into that particular field. So let's look at the examples. So this is how we define that particular at the rate configuration at the top of the class, and then inside this particular bean we want to get that particular instance of an bean, we define this, right? And we spoke about the configuration and along with that properties also. If you see, we have defined in the class part that application property, or you can define any other properties as well, and then inside that you have that particular key value pair, right? So we'll try to access that using the at the rate value. So these are the interview questions which are asked. So they will try to ask you what is the configuration class or what configuration annotation in a Springboot. How do you achieve that? How do you configure those? How you define using configuration? So we spoke about. We have just seen that how to define the bean using the configuration, right? So we have to use this particular two combinations. Now, what is the difference between this two at the rate component and the configuration? So basically, these are components which they have their own. This is a stereotype which is used for different beings. Like it can be applicable for a layer like service layer, repository. So if you see, at the rate component is a root level, the top annotation, and then there are certain annotation like at the rate service, at the rate controller, at the rate repository, right? So these are all sub component sub annotations of at the rate component. Now at the rate configuration, it will actually define there are certain configuration level information in this particular class. So it will indicate that it's an configuration we need to configure based on then certain configuration. So it will based on the class path and based on the annotation classes defined in it. Now we already spoke about beans. What is the life cycle of the bean? So there are different life cycles of a bean. Like when you try to load it, then there is a initialization, post initialization, pre initialization, right? So how can you inject the dependencies into a bean with the bean? So how do you load properties from an external property? So we have seen that how do we load that? What is the different way to use the specify location of a different ways to specify the location of a property file? So how many ways we can do that, right? What is at the rate value? What is the purpose of it, right? They will try to understand directly. They can ask you what is at the rate value, how do you use it, and how do you inject these values into the field using the at the rate value, right? What are the different ways to reference properties in at the rate values, right? So how do you write that? How do you there are different ways of you're defining, and there are we can use it when you're dealing with the data access layer, right? So there are different annotations. Uh, as I just sometime back mentioned, there is an at the rate component that's the top level annotation, and then we have a child annotation that is which will inherited from the at the rate component. So this is an at the rate repository. So this annotation is used to mark that particular class as a repository when you are dealing with the data layer, right? Indicating that it interact with the database, right? So when you're defining any repositories, right? Let's say you are defining an entity, and then you are trying to access that using the at the rate repository. So it will be directly it will have the role all you're trying to extend that particular JPA repository there, then you will perform that CRUD operation on at the rate transactional. This is in transactional level. It will define the boundaries of a method, right? Wherever you are defining it, right, it will be applying its own isolation level and the propagation level. There are different isolation and the propagation parameters which can be used up. Let's say how you want to how you want to deal with the the transaction aspect of your life of your application, right? You can define at the method level, and you can define it at the class level as well. So along with the combination of isolation and the propagation level, we can handle uh, the basic functionality of transacting the if there is a failure, you can roll back it, right? In what case you have to roll back, right? You can all configure in a declarative manner at the rate auto-wire. So this is an basic annotation, so which will automatically try to inject that dependencies into a class. So if you heard of dynamic polymorphism, so this makes use of that. Let's say you have an interface, right, and it's an there is a class which is going to implement it, right? So when you try to annotate this at the rate auto-wire, right, it will automatically look for the type which is implementing that particular interfaces, and it will automatically inject that dependency. It will automatically try to manage the content inside that container. It will manage that particular whole life cycle of creation and then destroying part, right? So it will be taken care with that particular at the rate auto while. So at the rate data, this is an specifically used in combination with trying to deal with a entity. So and then let's say basically you wanted to generate. So earlier, like when you're trying to manually create a getter setter for it at the rate constructor, like you will define the specific constructor, the default constructor or a parameterized constructor, equals and hash code implementation, two stick method implementation. So this will a lot of boilerplate code you used to write that, right? So there is a lot of dependency or a library where you will be able to write this annotation, and then you are free to uh, it doesn't need to define those implementation. It will be automatically taken care by this particular annotation. So if you see at the rate repository, so you see that on the product repository it's going to extend the JPA repository, so along with the key and the entity. So you'll perform different methods, right? CRUD repo methods. Now if you see it, there is an at the rate service. So this will denote that it is a service layer, right? So now under that you will see that the rate transaction we have defined, right? So it will be it is defined at the method level, if you see, right? So it will all the if there is certain exception, or if it is like it is saved, right, it will be handled internally by the container. So these are the interview questions which are asked with respect to the data layer, right? So what is repository, right? Now, how do you handle the exceptions in this particular data layer? What is like difference between Spring Data JT and at the rate repository? uh, Explain the concept of string transaction. So as I spoke about, declarative using of at the rate transaction, you can also define propagation and isolation level. So they would expect you to, revert back with an answer of, the detail how the transaction is going to work. So what kind of boundaries, as I said, you have isolation and propagation level, you can define those. uh, yeah, if you see, the next questions are about that. You can define what is the dependency injection in Spring Boot, right? So how do you deal with respect to auto-wide combination? How do you deal with that, right? How do it will be depending dependency will be injected into that particular variable, right? What is the difference between inject dependency? Different ways, how do you, what are the different ways you can inject it, right? There are type by name, and then different ways. Uh, so when you're trying to deal with an application, right, where you're trying to develop a code, there is a development, and then there is an unit testing phase, right, or the testing phase where you need to uh, perform the unit testing, the integration testing. There are different kind of testing which you need to perform. So you need to test your component to what the individual line of code what you have written, right? Whether it is performing, whether it is behaving properly or the way you have written. You can, there are different use cases you can test it out, right? So uh, these are the annotations. So which, with respect to, when you're trying to deal with a Spring Boot application, so we can make use of, the frameworks like JUnit, Mockito, Power Mockito. There are, Spy as well, right? So you can use that frameworks to, in order to, with the combination of Spring framework. So it provides an integration with those frameworks. So these are the annotations. So this is one of the Spring Boot test annotation. This annotation is used to create the application context where you're trying to deal with the a bean, right? So we need an application context, right? This is at the rate run with. So this is used to, to run specific, test runner, such as, Spring runner. What is this at the rate test? This is trying to, mark your method that, this has to be tested up. Okay. This is mock bean at the rate mock bean. This is used to create a mock bean object of for a certain dependency. So you have to inject some dependency, right? We can make use of this at the rate mock bean. So there are different other annotations as well, like at the rate setup, at the rate before, at the rate after, at the rate run, which we have already mentioned it. At the rate prepare for test, we can define those classes inside it. At the rate inject mock, so this is similar to the at the rate mock bean. So here is an example of, simple how to test that particular method, right? So how we write that particular test cases. So we have written at the rate Spring Boot test, and we have written two, at the rate mock and at the rate mock bean, right? Then we have at the rate mock, inject mock as well. These are all, injecting those beans, right, at the runtime, and then at the rate test we are trying to test that particular specific methods. So here, if you see, trying to test this particular data, right, and then, you're trying to asset it. As we looked into the other interview questions, with respect to test cases, also there are specific interview questions which, interviewer might ask you, like whether to understand, it's not only the development you need to, as a developer, you need to make care of writing the test cases as well for the whatever code you have written. So the purpose of, what is the purpose of Spring Boot test? How does it help in creating a fully configuration applications? How do you define application context, right? So we can make use of this. Uh, there are different web environment classes like options available in it. What is the role? What is the usage of at the rate run with? When to use it, right? When would you use this? And what are the other test runners apart from this, right? We can define. Now, how do you mark that particular method as in like how it will be able to test it, right? Which method to test, how it will identify the framework, right? We get to define at the rate test. What are the different annotations? Like as we have mentioned, like at the rate, these are all different annotation apart from what we looked into, right? So, what is the purpose of mock bean? Create a mock bean object for a dependency using mock bean. Then advantages of mock bean, right, over the manual mocking. I hope uh, this video has given some value to you, and you are able to grasp the annotations and the most common use annotations in Spring Boot application. Thank you. Thank you for